In honor of the one-year anniversary of the signing of the Abraham Accords, it was my great pleasure to be able to finally speak to the poet Sameeneh Shirazee about her poem, Grandmother. Good afternoon, Sameeneh. I'm so
Good afternoon.
excited to finally be able to meet you face to face, almost with the spirit in the news.
Almost.
I'm speaking today with Ms. Sameeneh Shirazee, who is the poet of the poem that so many of our teachers in Israel teach, the poem Grandmother. And so before I start talking to Sameeneh about that, I want to just share a little bit of background. Back when we first started the program in 2009, we were looking for background information about Sameeneh so that we could put something for the bridging text and context component. And I looked at the different pieces because I was a national counselor then for literature, and I looked at the different pieces and we couldn't find anything about Sameeneh. And then I realized, wait a minute, this lady is probably still alive. Like most of the poets and literature that we teach are written by dead people, old dead white guys. And this is someone who I probably could talk to. So I reached out to her and sent her an email. I see here September 5th, 2009. And I asked her if she would be willing to be interviewed, to send us some background information and to be interviewed. And she was thrilled to see this and said that she would be happy to, but had to check it out. Now, Sameeneh lives in Bahrain, and she'll give us more of her background, but Bahrain at the time did not have political connections with Israel. So in the end, we had to cut off this discussion and we were not able to pursue it. And all of a sudden this year, I thought, Abrahamic Accords. We're talking to Bahrain. People are flying. Israelis are flooding Bahrain. Maybe I can talk to her now. So this brings us up to today. And I ran the idea. Actually, one of my colleagues brought it up. I don't remember in which text, but she brought it up that maybe we could ask teachers to reach out to her. So I made a little clip and then I put it on a Padlet and I invited teachers in Israel who've been teaching the poem. Please add your impressions and anecdotes about how this poem touched you. And so this is what teachers did. They wrote about their impressions and their students' impressions, and this is all so magical, and I will be happy to share this in the link of this video when it comes out. And then I shared it with Sameeneh, and she was so
blown away.
It was just so here we are. It is August 12th, and despite all of the difficulties and political difficulties and internet difficulties and Zoom difficulties, here we are. And I'm happy to introduce, I'm going to stop sharing now so we can see Sameeneh in all her glory. And welcome. It is so
Thank you, Adair. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all this amazing stuff that you've been doing all over, for the last 12 years. I mean, it's just amazing to me that there would be this much of interest. It's just, it goes so much beyond the poem. It goes so much beyond the obvious. And that is, to me, it's very, very humbling, and it's very, very encouraging. And I'm just, I really have no words to thank you for what you've done, especially with the link that you created and all those amazing, that feedback that came through. It just, I would never have imagined it in 100 years.
Please tell us, Sameeneh, who inspired you to write this poem?
Right. So if I can just have a few minutes to tell you the whole story behind this poem. So In 1985, I was in my first year, 1984, I was in my first year of college, and in Pakistan, where I was born and I grew up. I studied at St. Joseph's College for Women, which at the time was one of the better known colleges. I was in my first year of a 4-year degree, and we had a visit from it was a cultural exchange visit organized by the Pakistan American Cultural Association. And this was a visit by an American poet called Naomi Shihab Nye. I'm sure you've read her work. She was visiting various cities in Pakistan, and she dropped in at our college. And she gave a talk. She sang some very lovely songs. And she talked about herself and her poetry and her journey as a poet. And I was so deeply moved by that meeting that during that meeting, she touched a nerve where she mentioned that, everything that a poet sees comes from a very deep and private part of ourselves. And the beauty of poetry to be able to touch that and to express it. And you just have to be open and become open to everything around you, the people, the experiences, the feelings, the emotions. And so she really inspired me. On my way home from college that day, I wrote a poem in the car. At the time, we had a driver who was driving me, so my hands were free, and I wrote this poem. It was about a flute seller who was actually at the traffic lights selling flutes. When I got home, I was in a tearing rush to get up to my room and write something. And so I rushed past my grandmother's room, which was just, after the entrance of our house. Her room was the first room. And it's customary in our culture to wish an elder when we enter the home. So we always say salam. And I said a very quick salam, and I just ran up the steps, and she called me back and she said, "What's going on? Why did you just rush past me like that?" Of course, I had to come back down. And she said, "Why did you just run away? What's the rush?" So I said, "Oh, no, I had nothing to say really, because how long would it have taken to say salam and to have asked her how she was?" So she stopped me in my tracks, and she began to tell me what she had done. Before she could even give me a chance to respond, she started telling me about her day and everything that she had done. And I remember still, she was all curled up, tiny and very, very frail in her bed, looking exhausted. I spoke to her for a few minutes, and then I went up to my room, and grandmother was written, of course, in a very raw form, which I then worked on. But that was the story of the poem. Now, as I mentioned, Naomi and I were corresponding, and sometime after this poem and 2 other poems were written, there was a competition that was held. I saw an ad in the newspaper one day saying, there's a competition, a poetry competition taking place, and, poets between the age of 16 and 20 can apply. They can send up to 3 poems. So I entered Grandmother and the Traffic Light. I don't remember what it was called, actually. I don't remember the name of the poem, but I entered those 2 and a 3rd poem. And again, time passed. There was no internet in those days. We had to wait, snail mail, and we had to wait for things to unfold the way they would. I think a few months passed, actually. And well, eventually I received a letter from the PACC saying, "Well, you've won this prize. There were 3 prizes and you're one of the prize winners." So of course I was thrilled. And I received as a prize, a beautiful set of dictionaries and a thesaurus, which I think years later, I donated to a school in Qatar where I was living some time ago. And but that was amazing. So I immediately wrote to Naomi and I said, hey, look what happened. This is what happened. And I entered this competition and I won. And so Naomi said, look, can you share the poem with me? I said, sure. So I sent it off to her. Um, Sometime later, and by now I was married, expecting my first child. And I got a letter from Naomi saying, okay, I'm putting this anthology together. It's called This Same Sky, and it's an anthology of young poets from all over the world. And I'd like to use your poem. Would it be all right with you? Um, and don't worry, I'm going to pay you for it. And so I said, yeah, sure. This was something unprecedented, which I had just never imagined. So I said, yeah, sure, no problem. Again, I sent her off the poem. And then I received all these contractual documents, which I was completely impressed by. Never seen anything like it in my life. And I got a check for $10, which I still have today. It was just the funniest thing. And so that's how this poem got published, actually. Um, I think Naomi moved soon after that. She was living in San Antonio at the time. And then, I don't know, I think she moved. And then we moved, and sadly, we fell out of touch. But the interesting thing, even today, to me, is that, this poem was inspired by someone whom I had never met before, who came from a completely different world to mine. And she inspired me to see someone that I had lived with every single day of my life since the time I was born, actually. And until that little push of inspiration, I guess, if you can call it that, I just never looked at this person. I engaged with her, I interacted with her, I loved her, and I love her still. But to see her as a person and to be able to tap into what I actually felt, that was, for me, it was a unique experience. And, I think one of the things that I realized was that, and then of course, subsequently, now by this stage, my grandmother was really aging and she was becoming more frail and more dependent on us physically. But the funny thing is that it took someone from outside my uh, parameter of relationships to point out something that I just hadn't seen. And I hope in some way that this poem has that effect on people even now, people who read the poem in the future, because it was just a very honest expression of something which, as a young person, I did not realize, I did not appreciate, which I do appreciate now, being much, much older, having grown children of my own, hoping to become a grandmother soon sometime. It just made me realize that, we just live our lives in such a rush. We stop to smell the roses, as it were. And that's sad. So I do hope that, young people can take this message away from the poem that, look, just don't be in such a tearing rush. Life will happen as it happens. But these relationships, these key relationships, our parents, our grandparents, our siblings, these are relationships which are irreplaceable, and value them. That's something that I think, well, that's what I took away from it, and from that experience. And so I thought I'd share that little story with you about how the poem actually came about. And well, my thanks to Naomi, really, and my grandmother, of course. But if it hadn't been for Naomi triggering this way of looking at things, perhaps the poem would never have been written, you know.
That is just such an amazing story. So your grandmother lived with you throughout your
Yes,
childhood until
yes.
the end. So what is the status of the elderly people in your, well, it's not your country, the country where you grew up.
Yeah. Well, in Pakistan, older people are a very central part of the family unit. But even here in Bahrain, I've lived here now, I think, almost 14 years. Even here, older people are very, very central to the home unit, to the family unit. They are rarely ever kept away from, things. I have a mother and she's aging, and she recently developed vascular dementia. And my daughter recently got married, and I wanted to share everything with her, but because of her health conditions, I couldn't. And it felt as if something very, very important was not there. And that was her presence, that was her involvement, that was her engagement with the planning and the thought process and the details. Um, while I was growing up in Pakistan, my grandmother was actually one of the older people in the entire extended family. And as a result of her presence in our home, we constantly had visitors. We had uncles and aunts visiting from overseas every summer. I can't remember a single summer in my childhood where I was actually in my own room. We were always moved out of our rooms and told, okay, you're sharing with your sister or you're sharing with so and so because X, Y, and Z are landing up with their children. And so we're going to be busy. And so every single summer in my childhood, uh, there is no memory I have where there aren't some other family members, some other cousins visiting from perhaps India or wherever they came from. We're scattered all over the world. And invariably, every summer, somebody or the other would visit Pakistan just to see my grandmother. And it's interesting because in our culture, there is this concept or notion that having an older person in your home is a blessing. It brings you what's called baraka. Baraka is bounty. And I always used to think, well, you know what? How can it mean bounty? Because bounty, it's actually expensive to host people every summer. And I don't know how my parents afford all of this. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that bounty is not tied up to finance. It's tied up to the feeling and the warmth and the affection that comes from these relationships. And I realized that having that older person in our home kept us connected to our family, to uncles and aunts, whom I have not seen since, to be honest. Once she passed away, they stopped visiting. And that was the bounty that is talked about in our culture, that older people bring this baraka, they bring this bounty and this gift and this blessing of connection and of relationships with people, which you wouldn't probably have if you didn't have those people in your life. And I see that today. My mom lives in the US, and a lot of people from across the US, a lot of our family and my cousins who have settled in the US for years, they now visit my brother's home where my mom lives because of her, because they had a relationship with her way back years ago in Pakistan, and that relationship matters to them. So they visit her, even though she's not her best anymore, even though she is not as well as she used to be. But for her, for them, she represents a piece of their past. And so they stay in touch with her. And again, I keep telling my brother, you're getting all the blessings because people visit you because of her. So value that and appreciate it. And so that's just something, that's another takeaway that doesn't quite make sense to a young person. You realize it as you get older.
Mm-hmm.
And when you don't have it, I live in Bahrain with my husband. My kids are overseas. I have no family in this country. I have a lot of friends, a lot of wonderful people who have become like family. Uh, but true family, people whom you're related to by blood, there's no one here. And I miss that. I long for it. There are days where I'm just miserable, pining for people that I haven't seen. And now, especially due to COVID, I haven't seen them in 2 years. So there's a lot that you realize as you get older, which doesn't mean anything to you when you're a young person. And well, I hope that young people appreciate what they have, because it doesn't last, and it's so important. It makes us who we are.
Absolutely. Uh, does do families in Pakistan still work that way? That the elders still live with their
Oh yeah.
families, not just
Oh
in
yes.
your family?
Yes,
Something
it's
that's
I think it's part of the culture. Of course, economics has a lot to do with it. There are families where, they don't have the means, but there is no system of, in Pakistan at least to date, there is no system of aged care homes. My mother-in-law lives in Canada. She is 97 this year, and she has now been placed in an aged care home, and the reason for that is not because she was not wanted, it's because her health requires 24-hour care. And my brother-in-law works, and my, brother-in-law's wife works, and they can't care for her the way she needs to be looked after. She's had multiple falls. And so, sometimes there is a reason beyond your control. They visit her thrice a week, and her aged care home is at quite a distance from where they live, but they make the effort. My sister-in-law visits very often, thrice a week. They have a rotation. In Pakistan, though, or in the subcontinent, the concept of aged care homes are not so prevalent. Um, and if they are, they're very, very costly. So they are outside the means of most people. But culturally and traditionally, the older people within a family are never removed from the family. They remain part of the home. Uh, they're simply part of the family. And I don't think that will change anytime soon. Even in Bahrain, it's the same. Sometimes when we could visit malls, um, I used to see people, families with their perhaps parents or grandparents pushing them along in a wheelchair. They bring them out. Um, so they are not in this culture and in this part of the world, and I think in the subcontinent, they are not really removed from the family. They remain together, and I hope they continue to. But I do appreciate that as families become more insular and more single unit families, it is economically difficult to look after older people. There's a lot that goes into looking after an old person. There is, their physical needs, their emotional needs, and it is challenging. It's in no way easy. And of course, if their health is such that they require specialized medical assistance, then that's again, it's an added cost. But I guess, in certain cultures, uh, the relationship transcends all of this. And I think people do prefer to have their parents or grandparents with them as long as they can.
Such a
That
blessing.
remains true.
That is such a blessing.
It is. It really is.
So, how do you feel as a Muslim? Uh,
Mhm.
how do you feel about having your poem on a national Israeli literature program?
Well, that is a really interesting question. Now, if I was still a Pakistani and I lived in Pakistan, there's no way that would happen. Um, I live in Bahrain and I'm an Australian, so I float above all these political barriers. It is an amazing feeling. It gives me goosebumps even now. Every time I hear that or I think about it, and I think, wow, how did that even happen? Um, but I think it puts into perspective the world that we live in. Um, I think it's sad that we have to have these boundaries that are created by politics, which we have no control over. But I think if you remove all of that noise, as I call it, and if you just look at the message of the poem, I think the reason this poem is interesting is because it's about human relationships. And I think that's what the world really is about. It's about people seeing each other, people understanding each other, people just putting the noise out of a dynamic and focusing on what is really important. Um, I mean, we've all read enough of history to know that, history is dark, history is painful. We've learned lessons from history, and many times we haven't learned enough lessons from history. But what is it that binds us to what went before us? It's our human relationships. Whether that relationship is in the context of a family or in a community or in a society, it's always those bonds that connect us. It's interesting, when I was growing up, part of my family, so my origin is Iranian, but my family, my ancestors left Iran, almost over 150 years ago, and they settled in the subcontinent. And then my great grandfather settled in Singapore. And Singapore at the time, in the late 18th century, was just a jungle. Excuse me. And he settled there. Then the Second World War took place, and they had to leave. My grandmother actually grew up in Singapore. She was born in India, but she lived and grew up in Singapore. In the Second World War, they had to flee when Singapore fell. They had to flee from Singapore, and they took the first vessel, which was a torpedo boat. They sat on that, and they just rushed away, fled literally from Singapore to Chennai, or Madras as it was called then, in India. And at that point, India was in its own state of flux, and there was a partition, threatening to occur. And they had gone from this very affluent, very comfortable lifestyle in Singapore to virtually being refugees in India. And then the partition of India and Pakistan took place. And so they then moved to Pakistan. When I was growing up, there was a lot of anti-India feeling, because India and Pakistan had 2, or in fact 3 subsequent wars after partition. And so when I was growing up, there was a lot of anti-India rhetoric all around us. But I didn't feel any animosity towards India. And, one day I came home from school. I must have been in, I think, the 7th grade. And there had been an argument amongst kids in school. And so I came home very upset, and my mom said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Oh, well, there was this chat that we had, and they were saying such horrible things. And why is it like that?" She says, "Well, I'll tell you why it isn't like that for you." I said, "Okay." She says, "You have to remember that you have family in India, and that's what connects you to that country. And you will never feel the same way as, the average Pakistani who doesn't have that human connection. So when you start to view your world off of a map, it's a very different view. But when you have relationships with people, wherever they live, then that's how you perceive a place. So when I think of this poem being read and being shared and being loved in a place like Israel, to me, it's humbling, because again, it's not about the geography. It's not about the borders. It's about those bridges that you mentioned. And that's what connects us to people. And that's what I hope it continues to do. So, you have to keep telling yourself that life is not just where I am today. It's who I was. It's where I've come from. It's everything that I carry along with me. But you have to keep self-checking and dropping away the things that chip away at what makes you you. And that's difficult to do. When there is so much of political rhetoric all around us, it becomes very difficult to keep separating that. But you have to do it. You simply have to do it.
What advice would you give to young aspiring poets about writing poetry?
Oh, just write as much as you can. write about everything that touches you, whether it's a flower, whether it's a bird, whether it's a feeling, whether it's an emotion, a person, just write. There's no right and wrong in writing. It's your voice. And just remember that as you get older, that voice will get influenced. So speak as much as you want, as much as you can, write things down. And over time, you will see that your own views change. That's just human nature. They evolve. But if you write when you are young and you continue to write as you grow, you will see how much you have evolved and how your own thought process has changed. And it's a gift. It's a gift to be able to say something which can touch other people. And I think that's a gift worth holding on to.
Sameeneh, thank you so much for your story and for your background and for your words of wisdom and for your poem and for the message.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish you all the best.